Alright, let's dive right into this. When you think about the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, you probably view it as this profound national tragedy, right? The devastating loss of a leader just as the brutal Civil War was finally drawing to a close. But in this explainer, we're going to look at that fateful night from a totally different angle. We are doing a ruthless security audit, because when you actually dig into the source material of what happened on April 14, 1865, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a catastrophic Swiss cheese-level failure of security protocols. I mean, layer after layer of defense literally just evaporated, letting an assassin walk right up to the President of the United States. So, here's our roadmap for the audit today. We're going to start with the presidency under threat. Then we'll check out the venue vulnerabilities and look at the catastrophic personnel failure of the missing bodyguard. From there, we'll trace the exact steps of breaching the box before zooming out to analyze the ultimate failure of the wider conspiracy. Okay, Section 1, a presidency under threat. Let's set the security context. 10,000. Just let that sink in for a second. That is the staggering number of death threats Abraham Lincoln had received since his election. He would sit there reading his presidential mail, letters from congressmen, letters from generals, and then letters bluntly stating that if he attempted to abolish slavery, he would be murdered. The president's life was under constant, documented, extreme threat. Actually, John Wilkes Booth, the guy who would ultimately pull the trigger, he'd already tried to kidnap the president twice before, but both attempts failed just because of Lincoln's last-minute schedule changes. And this contrast brilliantly illustrates the core dysfunction we're auditing today. On one hand, you've got this extreme daily threat level with organized plots of kidnapping and murder. But on the other hand, Lincoln's actual executive protection, it consisted of only 1 or 2 local police officers assigned to follow him around each day. That's it. In an environment where the president was getting thousands of death threats and literally having premonition dreams of a body lying in the White House East Room, his physical security detail was, by modern standards, practically non-existent. And what makes this even more tragic is that the danger was absolutely recognized by the people closest to him. This warning came from Officer Crook. He was a former police officer and widely considered the absolute best guard on Lincoln's minimal detail. After grinding through a double shift, Crook was going off duty and wouldn't be present that night. But before he left, he leaned in and explicitly warned the president, "Sir, don't go to the theater. It's not safe." But Lincoln, whose attendance had already been promised in the newspaper, went anyway. And strangely, instead of his usual "good night," Lincoln replied to his trusted guard with "Goodbye, Crook." Moving on to Section 2, the venue vulnerabilities, specifically looking at the inside threat. So, the massive security flaw of Ford's Theater was that John Wilkes Booth was the ultimate inside threat. Booth wasn't some unknown, sketchy drifter. He was a massive celebrity, think A-list actor of his day. And he knew every single corner of that theater because he'd worked there so many times. So on the actual day of the assassination, Booth was able to just walk right through the back door and move totally unimpeded through a theater buzzing with rehearsals, stagehands, and musicians. His fame gave him this crazy cloak of invisibility. Nobody questioned why he was there. Because he had this totally unrestricted access, Booth spent the day meticulously preparing the environment for his attack, completely undetected. First, he found out that the lock to Lincoln's box, Box 8, was already broken. I mean, a massive physical security failure right off the bat. Second, using a gimlet tool from his coat, he quietly drilled a spy hole straight into the entry door so he could see inside without being noticed. Third, he planted a wooden leg in the corner of the room, strategically stashing it so he could jam the door shut later. He was literally building his trap right under the noses of the theater staff. At one point, he even hid behind a door, holding his breath while a stagehand walked by to fetch a hat. The venue was thoroughly compromised hours before Lincoln even showed up. Alright, Section 3, the missing bodyguard. Let's look at the catastrophic personnel failure. Meet Officer John Frederick Parker. Remember how Officer Crook had worked a double shift and gone home? Well, Parker was brought in as the replacement guard, and crucially, Parker was not a regular on the president's detail. He had one job, literally one singular responsibility that night, as the president sat watching a play with his wife Mary Todd and their guests. Just sit outside the door of the presidential box and make sure nobody gets in. But, as we're about to see, he abandoned that post completely. To really wrap your head around the negligence here, just look at this timeline. About 30 minutes before the strike, Booth is pacing backstage, his adrenaline is spiking. He decides to step out a side door and head to the Star Saloon right next door to steady his nerves with a whiskey. So Booth is standing at the bar, kind of doubting his own plan, worrying about getting searched or having to fight the president's guard. He looks around the room, and he spots Francis Burns, Lincoln's driver. And sitting right there with the driver, casually drinking in the saloon while the president is completely unprotected in the theater, is the replacement bodyguard, John Frederick Parker. The guy meant to protect the president was getting drunk in the exact same bar as the assassin at the exact same time. It is just a stunning, bitter irony. Okay, Section 4. Breaching the box. Let's trace the final approach. Let's move to how this all builds to the fatal breach. Booth enters the theater, rushing right past a bunch of armed soldiers in the crowd who completely fail to notice him. He gets to the top of the stairs. Step 1. He bumps into the president's footman, Forbes, who is completely unarmed. Booth confidently hands him a calling card. Forbes recognizes the famous actor and, incredibly, just lets him pass. Step 2. Booth steps into the antechamber. He's gripping a knife at his waist, totally ready to fight the bodyguard, but the room is completely empty. Step 3. He grabs that wooden leg he planted earlier and wedges it into the door so nobody can follow him in. And Step 4. He steps right up to the door of Box 8 and peers through that pre-drilled spy hole. He can see Lincoln right there. But Booth isn't just going to burst in. He's an actor, right? So he is tracking the lines of the play happening on stage. He waits, his finger literally twitching on his Derringer pistol, listening for one very specific comedic line. He hears the setup from the stage, quietly turns the knob of that broken lock, and steps inside. Then, the actor on stage delivers the punchline. "Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, you suckandizing old man trap." And as 1,700 people erupt in roaring laughter, Booth raises the pistol behind Lincoln's left ear and fires. The laughter of the crowd is so loud, a lot of people actually thought the gunshot was just part of the show. Major Henry Rathbone realizes what's happening and lunges at him, but Booth slashes him to the bone with a knife, leaps from the box, snaps his leg on the stage floor, yells out to the crowd, and vanishes into the night on a waiting horse. The breach was complete and, tragically, perfectly timed. Which brings us to Section 5. The ultimate failure, the coordinated strike. Because Booth's goal wasn't just to kill Lincoln, he wanted to completely collapse the Union government. While Booth targeted the president, Lewis Powell was assigned to kill Secretary of State William Seward. Powell actually managed to breach Seward's home and stab him, but Seward miraculously survived the attack. Meanwhile, George Atzerodt had the job of assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson, but Atzerodt decided to calm his nerves at a bar, ended up getting way too drunk, and totally failed to even make an attempt. So, while Booth's co-conspirators failed due to sheer luck or their own incompetence, Booth succeeded. Why? Because every single layer of the president's security detail evaporated exactly when it was needed most. The president clung to life in a boarding house across the street before passing away the next morning, sparking a massive 12-day manhunt that eventually ended with Booth surrounded and shot in a Virginia barn. So, as we wrap up this security audit, I want to leave you with a final, kind of haunting question. If one replacement bodyguard, John Frederick Parker, hadn't decided to abandon his post and go next door for a glass of whiskey at the exact moment a famous actor was plotting murder, how would history be different today? It's a really stark reminder that modern executive protection, the rigorous multi-layered security protocols we see today, was fundamentally shaped by the entirely preventable, cascading vulnerabilities of this one single night.